Welcome to Hurt at Work, a Kentucky workers' comp podcast. Today, Louisville Workers' Compensation attorney Scott Scheynost is going to provide helpful information, tips, and advice for injured workers and their families. Scott's goal is to help you to maximize the benefits you receive. If working's got you hurting, sit back and listen to Scott address topics that matter to you. Well, welcome back to the podcast. This is episode 5, and today, Scott Scheynost, who's a local workers' compensation attorney right here in Louisville, Kentucky, is going to talk about what to expect when you contact the office. I know a lot of people are nervous about calling law firms, and they're just not sure what they need to do or how they need to handle that call. So Scott's going to give you some information about some things you might want to prepare for and be thinking about when you pick up the phone. So Scott, welcome back, guy. Good to see you.
Glad to be here again.
Absolutely. So let's jump into this. As far as one of the first questions you ask, which I was surprised to hear is actually sometimes confusing, who do you work for? Who's your employer?
Yeah, when somebody calls the office with some questions about workers' compensation, there's generally a dialogue between us, and I think it helps us to talk about that a little bit right now so we can go through the process a little bit easier for both of us. But there's several things that I've found out over the last couple of years that have really surprised me that we need to know that a lot of people don't know without thinking about it or doing a little research. One of those is who is their employer.
Yeah.
And probably about 30% of the time when I deal with folks, they have a hard time answering that question, which is real surprising to me. But if you start thinking about how business has evolved, there's a lot of things going on. There's corporations, there's subsidiaries, there's holding companies, there's
temporary services,
there's DBAs. And a lot of times I'm just going to say, somebody comes in and says they work for Smith, general name. Is it Smith Incorporated? Is it Smith and Jones? Is it
Smith and Sons?
Smith of North America?
Right.
Because all that really has a bearing on who's going to eventually pay your workers' comp benefits. And sometimes we get in disputes where the employer doesn't do what they're supposed to, and we actually have to sue somebody. But we've got to be able to figure out who your employer is to go through the process, to get the claim started, to go through the Department of Workers' Claims. And seems like a lot of employers just hide their names to me. A lot of folks work for temporary agencies. Kelly Services is just a popular temporary agency. I've got a couple claims with them right now. You may work for Kelly Services, but you may actually be working at Toyota, for instance.
So you got injured at Toyota, but the answer who your employer is not actually Toyota. It's really Kelly Services.
Correct. And when people call in, they say, I got hurt at Toyota. This is Toyota workers' comp injury. Well, you find out that they're not actually employed by Toyota, at least yet. They're working for Kelly Services. And that has a bearing on a lot of things. First of all, we got to know, like I said before, who the employer is to be able to file the claim properly. But also the employer a lot of times calls the shots in the claim, and that gives us an indication of where the claim is going to be going. A lot of employers are self-employed. A lot of employers are self-insured, which means they may have a TPA, a third-party administrator, handling the claim, but they're actually the ones calling the shots. That really happens with a lot of the big employers.
Well, like here in Louisville, is GE still self-employed? Is that?
Well, GE Hair, yes, I believe they are, and it's actually two different entities. That gets interesting sometimes if you've got somebody that was working for the company, had injury when it was GE, and now GE Hair. But they are self-insured, as I understand it. They have another party that actually administers the claim, but
that's that TPA, that third-party administrator.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that gives us a little bit more insight about where the claim's going. Certain employers handle claims differently. Some of them, are a little bit harder to deal with, but that gives us a little bit insight about where we're going. But your employer is absolutely vital to know in a workers' compensation claim. A lot of people really have a hard time understanding that because they may work at Smith Factory.
Right.
But actually, they're getting paid by Smith North America Incorporated. And a lot of places have DBAs now, too. An old one was, I think, 84 Lumber, which was really Cashway Systems. I don't know if anybody remembers that company. Yeah. But there's a lot of things that become very important in a workers' compensation claim, and we got to know who your employer was. The best way to do that, if you're getting to run around at work, is to look at your W-2 forms.
Okay.
Sometimes the actual checks may have the DBA on there, or may have a third party, for instance, ADP, a payroll company, giving you the check. But eventually you're going to get a W-2 form, and that W-2 form's got to show who your employer is. And that's what we really need to know. That's how all the information is going to be recorded for the government. If you're applying for Social Security benefits, that's who they're going to be looking for to see what they paid into the system. If we have a workers' comp claim, we'll use that actual name to go through the Department of Workers' Claims to find out if your injury's been reported, to find out when your statute of limitations run. But it's actually something I would never thought I would have to bring up, but it is actually pretty important because about 30% of the people have a hard time actually identifying who their employer is.
Now, as far as an employer, that you also have to look at some classifications as far as what type of employer that is. I know there's some exclusions for your practice, such as federal and things like that. Do you want to talk about that for a little
Yeah,
bit?
certain things are not covered by Kentucky workers' compensation. For instance, if you're working for the federal government, especially the post office, they have their own workers' comp system. Other employers may have their own workers' compensation system. For instance, railroad employees and people that might work on a barge, they have the longshoremen. So your employer determines not only who's responsible, but it also determines the process we go through in getting your benefits. Some people are hurt, say, in Afghanistan. They're a contractor. They've been hauled over from the United States to do some security work in Afghanistan. Well, that's actually a workers' comp claim. It's what we call a DBA claim,
Okay.
and it's similar to some of the federal government stuff. But
So if I were a PMC, a private military contractor, and I'm going over there, like you said, I'm going to do some security in Afghanistan, and I get hurt, that actually, because it's a private company, is a workers' comp claim.
correct, and it'd be governed by the Defense Base Act,
Okay.
which is entirely separate from the Kentucky workers' compensation system.
Exactly.
So I don't want to make this too complicated, but who your employer is very important, and it's the one thing we've got to look at to figure out where everything else flows from. And it's, again, amazing to me that a lot of people are unable to identify their employer, not usually because of their fault, because sometimes the employer actually hides it. So we need to figure that out. The next thing we probably need to know that comes up a whole lot is, when were you injured? That has a bearing on how long we've got to file a claim. It has a bearing on how much your benefits get to be paid, because that changes from year to year. And I talked to a gentleman this week. He got injured, he thinks, in 2017, but he couldn't remember exactly when. Well, that's a problem, because there's a 2-year statute of limitations, and it may have run in 2019.
And let's come back. That statute of limitations, you want to explain what that is?
Sure. There's a statute of limitations in workers' compensation, which means you only have a certain time limit to file what we call a formal workers' compensation claim with the Kentucky Department of Workers' Claims. Now, in Kentucky, the statute of limitations for a traumatic injury, for instance, if you get hit by a forklift, is 2 years. 2 years from the date of the injury, or 2 years from the last date that you received temporary total disability benefits, which are...
And we talked about that in one of the previous episodes,
right,
actually.
Lost wages for being off work. So most cases are traumatic injuries. There's other statute of limitations for other things, for instance, for coal miners and exposures to occupational disease. But for most people, it's going to be that 2-year statute of limitations, and it's going to run from the date of the injury or the date that you last got money for being off work because of the injury. So first of all, we got to figure out what the date of the injury is for a lot of people. A lot of times they don't get money for being off work. A lot of folks that call me can't tell me what the date of the injury is. Again, that's real important. There's ways to figure that out. If you saw a doctor the day of the injury, we can get your medical records.
Right.
But that takes time. It can take 6 to 9 months sometimes to get medical records. Even though we're supposed to be able to get them sooner than that, the way the systems are set up, it may take a long time to get those. So if you've got a statute of limitations that runs in 2 or 3 weeks, and it takes us 2 months to get your medical records, we're going to have a problem.
So this is one of those situations where you really need to be proactive. If you've been injured, you need to kind of be worrying about protecting yourself here.
You need to have some basic information available. Your employer, your date of injury. Most people are going to know these things, but again, a lot of people, just for whatever reason, don't keep track of it. Maybe you had a head injury, and maybe you're having a hard time remembering this.
Yeah.
And then some injuries too are what we call repetitive injuries, and they don't happen all at once, but they happen over the course of your employment, and those are hard to figure out. I don't want to get too much into that, but a lot of that depends on your medical treatment and when you first went and saw a doctor. So the date of injury is very important in a workers' comp claim. That determines the statute of limitations we were talking about. It also determines the amount of benefits that you might get. And here lately, they've been changing the law. The last change was in 2018. And a lot of times that determines on whether or not you're going to get a certain level of benefits, because the law may have changed.
Right. Well, and at the same time, you're also required, as part of this system, to give your employer notice as soon as it's practicable.
Right. And again, that goes back to the date of the injury. So we have to figure out what was a reasonable amount of time after the date of the injury to give the employer notice.
Right,
You're required to give notice. If you know you got injured at work and you tell your supervisor that day, you're okay. If you got hurt, you can't really figure out if it was at work or maybe something around the house. So you can go see the doctor, and he says, well, you must have done this lifting at work. And, well, then you've got to tell the employers that at that point that you have a possible workers' compensation injury, even though it might be a couple weeks after it actually occurred. So the date of the injury is very important. And again, probably about 20-30% of the folks that we talk to have a hard time figuring that out. We can do a lot of research to figure that out, but it helps if you do that on your own. It just makes it go a little bit smoother when we first start talking about stuff. and we can figure out things a little bit quicker in your case.
Well, I would think the next thing that they need to be prepared for is really to understand how to communicate the details of the injury. You know, what, where, symptoms, things like that.
Right. Some injuries are pretty obvious. If you get hit by a forklift, I keep using that as an example. You know when it happened, how it happened. Other things are a little bit more fuzzy. For instance, if you have carpal tunnel syndrome due to repetitive motion at work, we've got to identify that repetitive motion. Sometimes lower back injuries are caused because of repetitive lifting at work. We've got to identify what you were doing and how that occurred. Other things can happen, and people have a hard time remembering exactly what occurred. They may start having a problem in their leg, and then all of a sudden they remember that 2 weeks before that they slipped and fell at work, but it didn't really bother them enough until a couple weeks later they started having increased pain and went and saw a doctor. So the details of what happened are really important. First of all, we got to know if it was workers' comp from the details. Secondly, when you see a physician, a doctor, a chiropractor, whoever, you've got to be able to relate to them what happened. And when you relate to them what happened, they're going to make a history in their records of how the injury occurred. If you do not mention in that history that you were hurt at work, you've caused a lot of problems in your claim. The very first thing that the workers' comp adjuster is going to do is request a history of the physicians, the doctors, the medical providers, chiropractors you've seen. And if those records don't reflect that you got hurt at work in the very beginning of them, and if it can't be explained, you're probably not going to get benefits voluntarily. You've created a big problem in your case if you don't tell the medical providers that treat you how you got injured. So sometimes it's hard for people to identify this, but there's got to be that relationship to your injury at work in the medical records to be successful with a workers' compensation claim.
And I guess from there, once you've kind of identified what the injury is, what the symptoms are, what kind of treatment they may have already been treating, right?
Right. Generally, in a workers' compensation claim, one of the first things we're going to do is get your medical records. So all the doctors, physicians, medical providers, chiropractors you've seen are very important. So you need to know who those are. A lot of guys, well, I got a surgery. Who did the surgery? I can't remember. Well, we've got to know. We've got to get that operative note. We've got to see what the surgeon said. We've got to get that history that says whether or not you got hurt at work. We've got to get your medical records that show what your impairment rating is. So all the places you've been to for medical treatment are very important. We will request all the medical records for every medical provider that's treated you to make sure that those records line up with your injury, to make sure there's not some other thing that has to be examined to rule out it has some kind of bearing on your workers' compensation claim. But we've got to get all those medical records. We've got to figure your claim out. Secondly, we will usually provide those medical records to one of our experts to review, and they'll use those medical records to determine whether or not your injury was actually work-related too. So it's something we have to do. It's something that our experts have to do. Eventually, if we have to file a claim, the administrative law judge will also look at all these medical records too, and they'll go review those to determine whether or not you actually have a work-related injury. And another thing that's very important is the workers' comp carrier. They're going to review them also.
Yep.
So, anytime you've seen a doctor, if you've got a family doctor, you usually tell that doctor when you see them that I saw, an expert, Dr. Smith, for a colonoscopy 2 months ago. Well, you may have forgotten 5 years later that you had the colonoscopy, but the family doctor's got in his records that you had this colonoscopy. And what happens is the workers' comp carrier will go through your records, see that you had this colonoscopy with this other doctor. They'll request your records from this other doctor too, because you may have told that other doctor that you hurt your back 2 weeks before you had the colonoscopy. Your back was hurting too. So it's kind of a chain reaction. Once you get one set of medical records, that usually leads to another set of medical records. In another life, I used to be the defense attorney that would go through all these medical records looking for some other reason that's causing your problems other than a work-related injury. Is there a car accident? Is there prior work-related injury? Is there something else going on that's trying to cause these problems that you're alleging happen at work? So there's going to be somebody actively looking at all your medical records, not only for the ones for the injury, but also probably all your other medical records to make sure that all this fits together. And you got to remember, the insurance company, the other attorney, has a monetary incentive to prove that this is not work-related. So they're going to be very thorough in all these medical records. It's important for you to let me know who you've seen, because I tell folks this is kind of like walking through a minefield. If you've got a problem in your medical records, we can usually deal with it if we know about it.
Right.
It's like a mine. If you know where the mine is in the minefield, you can walk around it.
Yep.
But if you don't know where that mine is and you step on top of it and it blows up, you've got a problem. So if you've forgotten about something in your medical history that has a bearing on the claim, and I don't know about it, but we're at a deposition, we're at a hearing where it comes up, and the other side's got all the information, and they bring this up, and we haven't talked about how to handle it, that can be disastrous in your workers' compensation claim. That's happened to me before. People have forgotten they've had injuries before. People have forgotten they've had surgeries before.
Well, they're not even thinking it's related to this. However, from an insurance standpoint, they're going to try to make that connection.
Correct. And a lot of people think in going through your medical treatment, the only thing I need to know about is the medical treatment related to the injury. But we will eventually need to know all your medical treatment. Any previous injuries, those are always important. Motor vehicle accidents, any previous major surgeries, any previous major medical treatment. For instance, diabetes, if you've been treated for that and you've got some kind of nerve problem, well, diabetes can sometimes cause a nerve problem. And if we're alleging an injury to your nerves at work, that can have a bearing. And a lot of times the defense will try to argue that this nerve problem is actually caused by diabetes. It's not caused by work. And, diabetes is not usually work-related. A lot of people won't tell me about that, but it still can have a bearing on your case.
Right, because it's about the compensation for the injury.
Exactly. And again, the other side is trying to find anything they can to keep you from getting money.
Well, when you start talking about this set of medical records leads to that set of medical records to that, earlier in this episode, you'd mentioned that sometimes it takes quite a period of time to actually gather all these records.
Right.
So again, with that statute of limitation ticking, you could run out of time here.
Yeah. Most people don't have a complete set of their medical records with them.
Yeah.
A lot of
why,
people,
why would you?
Well, exactly. A lot of people go to the doctor and they'll get a note from the doctor that they were there that day, or you go to the hospital and you get these discharge notes. Those aren't your medical records. We need something that the doctor actually creates. And usually what happens when you go in to see a physician, you'll see them and then the doctor will turn around and dictate a note that goes into your medical records that talks about what you did, talks about your history, talks about what he wants to do. And we'll look at that, and that may be entirely different from what he actually told you, or at least what you're telling me he told you.
There'll be much more detail.
Usually much more detailed, usually a little bit more honest, too, about where it's going. The doctors will sometimes talk about other treatment they think may be influencing this or other problems that they may not go over with you. And my experience with most clients is they tend to hear what they want to hear.
Yeah.
And it's just a natural human reaction. You want to hear the good things that help prove your case. You don't want to hear the bad things. And we have to go through the medical records to get the true picture. And a lot of doctors, will tell you one thing, but they won't put it in the medical records. They may say it's work-related, but when it comes down to putting in the medical records, they may not say that. When it comes down to writing a report that says it's work-related, they may not want to get involved in that. So we've got to flesh out all the details, and the way we do that is through the medical treatment records. They're really fun to go through. They can be very voluminous. Another problem is it takes a while to get them.
Yeah.
And if you walked in my office right now, and we talked about your case, I would have to get your medical records, and generally 2 to 3 months is the turnaround time for all the medical records.
Although it could be much longer.
It could be shorter, but most of the time it's longer, not shorter.
So again, coming back to some of the questions you might want to be prepared for, before you make that call, if you're already dealing with the comp carrier, what's the status there? I mean, these are things you need to know.
Right. That helps me know where your case is going. If the workers' comp carrier has turned down your case for whatever reason, there's not going to be any brilliant letter I can write to the workers' comp adjuster usually to change your opinion. There's not going to be a magical phone call I can make to change anybody's mind. We're probably going to have to file a claim, which means it's going to be a little bit longer, a little bit more expensive, and we need to talk about what's going to be entailed in that so you're ready for it. At the same time, if the workers' comp carrier has accepted the claim, and if they're paying for your medical treatment, well, we've got a green light for right now, but there might be a red light around the corner.
Yeah.
Workers' comp carriers usually don't like you being off work more than 6 months, and if you are off work more than 6 months without any significant medical treatment going on, they will usually try to do things to get you back to work.
Right.
They may send you to the doctor. They may start giving you a little bit more attention in your case than they did before. But usually something will happen in about 6 months that will impact your case. So we need to know where all that's going.
And just as an aside here, you did say it gets a little bit more expensive. To clarify, that's not the client paying you out of pocket. This stuff is not something. This is not an hourly. This is the fees for an attorney in a workers' comp case are handled at the back end of the case. Correct.
Correct. We handle these on what's called a contingency fee basis, which means that we don't get paid unless you do, and we usually get our fee at the end of the case when your case is over. Sometimes there might be some payments during the course of it, but almost 95% of the time, we're not going to get paid until your case is completely over. So the fees we're talking about, expenses we're talking about right now, are really the workers' comp carrier's expenses. They pay a lot of things that you don't get. They pay for doctors. They pay for folks to look at your case. They pay for other folks to what we call independent medical examiners to review your file sometimes. There's a lot of expenses going out that you don't see. You'll see the money coming in, but that's probably less than half of what the cost of an actual case is anymore. The money that people actually receive, the injured employees, more money spent out in more money spent out in medical treatment than actually is paid to the employee now, and the insurance companies are almost always very sensitive about that money. When you're going to have a surgery, they're going to look at your case a little bit harder. They'll usually have that examined by another doctor to determine whether or not they have to pay for it. So the medical treatment is really the big thing and big cost driver in a lot of these cases right now, even though you don't see it. They may be spending $50,000 that you never see, but it's very important to them because it's their money. So again, the medical records and how that relates to everything, where the workers' comp carrier is going, that gives us an idea about what we're going to do. If a doctor has ordered medical treatment and workers' comp's paying for you to be off work and they're paying for the doctor, the workers' comp carrier will look at the medical treatment real hard, basically according to how expensive it is. Yep. If he wants to give you a $20 medicine, that's not going to be a big deal. If he wants to do a $25,000 surgery, they're going to look at that real hard.
Yeah.
So you can expect some speed bumps in the road of the workers' compensation claim if you're going to get some significant medical treatment. It helps for us to know where those speed bumps are and how everything's going with the carrier. That just gives us a general idea about what's going on.
Well, that brings us to this case. You've got to ask this, and the best way to answer this is be straightforward with it. Are you currently working with another attorney? Have you retained another attorney?
Yeah, sometimes we talk to people on the phone, and my staff, when they screen your call and when I call, I'll generally ask you. But a lot of people don't always tell us that they actually have another attorney involved in this, or they may have it at one time. That has a bearing on what I can really do as far as talking to you. That has a bearing on what else is going on in your claim. If you've got another attorney involved in this and you haven't mentioned me, that can cause a lot of ethical problems on my end of it. I wouldn't want to be treated that way if I was an attorney. If you're having problems with your attorney, I generally suggest that you contact them, talk to them, see if you can sit down and work those problems out. You're generally going to be better off dealing with the original attorney in your case, because if you go to another attorney, it's just like starting over. They've got to see what the file is, look at your medical records. They don't know what's going on in your case. There's a lot of natural delays in the workers' comp claim system process. A lot of those aren't your attorney's fault, even though there's delays trying to figure out if you're going to get surgery, if this is going to happen, that's going to happen. It's not always your attorney's fault. And sometimes people just have to have that explained to them.
But it keeps you out of ethical problems with the Kentucky Bar Association.
Right. Or any other attorney, too. I don't want to step on somebody else's toes.
Yeah, absolutely.
It creates a mess in your case, too, if you've got two people working on it. And plus, the adjuster is not going to deal with me if you've already got another attorney involved in it.
But at the same time, there could be types of attorneys who focus in, let's say, car accidents, but there is a corresponding workers' comp claim, and they're not going to handle that. So you could work together, or Social Security disability, insurance.
For instance, I don't normally handle Social Security disability claims. I usually refer those to a gentleman named Trevor Smith, that we'll probably be talking about later. If you've got somebody else working on another claim, for instance, a Social Security disability claim or a car accident claim, if they're not working on the workers' comp aspect of it, I can help you. But it's important to know who's out there and what they're doing, exactly what they're representing you for. A lot of attorneys that do motor vehicle accidents don't do workers' compensation. So if you are handling a car accident case with somebody else, they may not want to mess with a workers' comp claim. That actually happens a lot. I get referrals from other attorneys for that kind of stuff. But it helps us to know if you've got that other attorney, because we have probably information that will help them, and we can exchange that if that's okay with you. That makes your case go a little bit faster in both situations. It saves time, it saves money, generally helps the outcome to be a little bit more successful for both of us too. So if you've got somebody else involved, you just need to let us know about that. Need to let us know what's going on, what they're representing you on, all those kind of things. Even if you talked to another attorney before, some people I've dealt with have told me that they've talked to folks and they're not represented by them. Okay, when the last time you talked to them? 6 months ago, that's fine. We get involved in the case. Well, they actually signed a contract that nobody knew about. We've got to deal with that. Generally, the attorneys can work that out amongst themselves, but it creates a lot of problems that just delay your case and are not really good for anybody involved in this.
And speaking of problems, I guess one of the questions that you're going to ask is what are some of the biggest problems? What are some of the biggest concerns you're dealing with right now? Because I mean, this is about customer service at the end of the day. This is about taking care of that client,
Right.
and so you want to know kind of what's really on your mind right now.
Right. And what I find is a lot of people call and they're worried about what their permanent disability is going to be in the case, but they're not getting any money right now for being off work. So it might be a year and a half before we can get this permanent disability thing resolved. But right now they need some money in their pocket. What's your biggest problem right now? Are they not paying for the medical treatment? Maybe you are getting money for being off work, but a doctor's ordered surgery, workers' comp decided not to pay for it. Is that the big issue? Well, what is your biggest concern right now? Are you going to be able to do this job the rest of your life? What am I going to be able to do after the surgery's over? I may not be able to go back to work at this job. All those things are really important to you. They're important to me too. But that also helps us solve your problem a little bit faster if we know what's really the biggest concern. A lot of this stuff we just need to know about, and we'll be able to deal with it later. If you're worried about your job and what you can do down the road, at the end of your claim, you might be eligible for a thing called vocational rehabilitation, which is retraining.
Yep.
You may not be able to go back to work at that old job because you hurt your back and you can't lift that stuff anymore, but you might be eligible for another job. That's something that we need to explore right now because we need to see what your likes are. If you like working with computers, for instance, a computer class might be good for you.
Well, I know we talked about vocational training in a previous episode. So in the show notes below this actual podcast, I'll actually put a link back to that episode. Okay. So people can go back and go, well, what are my options there, and who might qualify and who might not qualify?
Yeah, they call vocational rehabilitation the stepchild of workers' compensation because nobody really likes to talk about it. It's not a guaranteed thing that you can get in workers' compensation, but especially for folks that are relatively young, which is for me 45 and below, especially somebody that's gone to school and been successful in school, you have a right to have at least 52 weeks of school paid for by the workers' compensation insurance carrier. That's tuition, books, maybe even room and board, mileage going back and forth. I had folks involved in this where they needed a computer. They lived out in the country. They needed access to internet. Most schools right now do a lot of stuff over the internet. So if you're going back to school, you're probably going to be dealing with needs for computers and internet access. So there's a lot of things involved in vocational rehabilitation. Sometimes the money for that can actually be greater than the money in your workers' compensation claim. If you're a good candidate for it, and you're a good candidate, the younger you are, it's really up to a judge to decide whether or not you're a good candidate. I've had judges tell me if you're over 45 years old, they don't think you're a good candidate to go back to school. But if you're 20, 25, 30, if you've shown an inclination to go back to school, most judges want to help you out.
Yeah.
And most judges want to make your life better. They understand you've been through a traumatic injury, and they want to see if there's something they can do to help you out with it. So if you're a good candidate for it, sometimes we can get that for you. The problem with it is just not automatic. We need to do some background work on it. You need to check out some things. What do you like to do? Well, maybe you want to be a gunsmith. Well, where's a gunsmith school? Well, I don't know. You may have to go down to Knoxville, Tennessee for that.
Right.
Well, what do they require to be a gunsmith? Well, you may have to have a GED at least. And, you may have to have the ability to manipulate things with your hands. So you've got to do a little bit of background work to see if you're eligible for certain things. And you've got to do a little bit of work to make the judge's job easy. That shows the judge, number one, that there's something out there that you could do, but also it tells the judge, I'm interested in this. If you've gone and done all the research in this and demonstrated to the judge that you want to do this, they're going to think that you're fired up about it, and they will honestly want to help you. So that can be a big thing for folks. As we get older, that's harder to do.
Yeah.
And instead of vocational rehabilitation, we might be talking about Social Security disability instead.
Well, and some of these, depending on age is obviously a factor, but some of these workplace injuries could also be career-ending. Right.
If you're 62 years old and you've worked all your life with your hands, you're going to have a hard time going back to that if you can't use your hands. I don't think any judge is going to expect you to go back to school and learn a new trade. To be an adjuster for the insurance company, to do estimates on body damage or anything like that. At 62 years old, I tell folks they're kind of like me. You can't tell me anything as a know-it-all. and at a certain point, there's no use in sending you back to school because you know it all. The judges realize that. So instead of the retraining, I think what's more of a viable option in that situation is Social Security disability benefits.
Right.
And I guess we'll save all the requirements for that for a later podcast, but that's something else that's available for you too. And again, what's your biggest problem is what am I going to be able to do after I recover from this injury? Well, maybe Social Security disability might be the answer for that. Most people don't want to go on disability, but If you're 62 years old, and you've worked as a laborer all your life and you can't lift more than 5 pounds, that might be our only answer.
Well, and at the same time, as it relates to the Kentucky workers' comp system, a lot of the things out there, a lot of the treatments, whatever, you do have a right to lifetime benefits. So you could have some of that coming in,
Yeah.
but combine that with the Social Security disability insurance. You're not going to get rich necessarily, but there are ways to make it work.
Yeah, in Kentucky, you have a right to lifetime medical benefits. They've modified this a little bit. After 15 years, you've got to show that you still need it, which nobody's really figured out how they're going to do that. So I don't talk about it much. Probably about 15 years from 2018, which is when it's going to come into effect. We'll all know the answers to this, so I don't want to talk about it too much. But yeah, you do get lifetime medical expenses if you show that you still need it. For this year until the legislature meets again.
Right.
But again, what are your problems? Are you not getting the surgery? Is
not getting medication?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Are they paying for your mileage expense? Is your boss talking about not taking you back even though you're going to be able to do the job? Is there some kind of retaliation going on with the employer? What's your biggest issue? Yeah. And my job is to solve your biggest problem. Sometimes folks tell me their biggest issue, and I look at it, and it's not really their biggest issue. You may have a claim where, you're trying to figure out what the case is worth, but this case may not let you go back to work. And, that situation's hard to talk about, but we've got to look for the long term too, and we've got to be prepared for that.
Yeah.
So
and that's when your years of experience comes to play, because
Right.
I mean you've done this, you've been dealing with clients who are facing these major decisions, and you know how to counsel them, and you kind of understand the system obviously, so you know what's most likely going to happen, based on this individual case.
Right. And sometimes the biggest problem isn't your problem; it's your spouse's problem. They're more worried about the money you've got coming in. You're going to find a job somewhere, but it may not be as much as it was before. What are they going to do with that stream of income? Sometimes we have to get the spouse involved and talk to them.
Yeah.
That also has a bearing later on at the end of the case, because sometimes we'll talk about settlements, and we can arrange those in a way where we try to solve some of your problems. I've had folks tell me that what they really needed is to have their house paid for. That's their biggest concern, is making sure that the house is taken care of for the rest of their life.
It's a big sense of security there.
Yeah, and if we don't know that's what they want, we might handle it a little bit differently. So I need to know what you're really trying to get out of this, what your biggest concerns are, and my job is to make you happy as much as we can. So if you tell us what's going on, we can try to help you.
Well, and I think to wrap up this episode, one of the other questions that you just generally need to know about is, what's the employer's attitude at this point?
That's another thing too, especially if it's a self-insured employer. They're the ones actually calling the shots. If you get along with those folks, then we will probably have an easier time with your workers' comp claim if things are going bad at the plant for whatever reason, they're cutting back. If it's self-employed and they're treating people differently, then we know a little bit more about where this is going. Are they retaliating against you for having a workers' comp claim? Have they cut your hours? Some of these things have an impact on the workers' comp claim. Some of them are actually separate causes of action outside of workers' comp that we're really not going to get into. But they're not supposed to discriminate against you for having a workers' compensation claim. If they are accommodating to your injury, for instance, if you have an injury that prevents you from doing your old job, but they're willing to find another job for you, which they're not required to in Kentucky, that has an impact on your claim too. Because being able to return to work at the same wages that you had at the time of your injury has a big bearing on how much money you get out of this. Some employers won't take you back at all if you have any physical restrictions. Other ones, especially ones with unions, will do anything they can to get you back to work. And you could end up in a job that's not as strenuous, but making as much money as you did before. That actually has a big bearing on how much you get out of the workers' comp claim. So your employer's attitude, that has an influence on where all this is going. It's nice to know what you feel is going on. You probably have a better grip on what's going to happen than anybody else. So if you think your employer is going to be giving you a hard time, let me know. We can talk about some of those issues involving that too.
Well, my friends, that's pretty much a wrap for episode 5. Scott, again, I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate your knowledge on this. And I hope these podcasts are in a format that's just easier for people when they've got a lot on their minds. They're dealing with these types of injuries and they've got questions. Sometimes listening to a podcast is a lot easier than reading page after page on a website or a blog somewhere. And if somebody decides, okay, yeah, I'm ready to take that step and they want to give you a call, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Best thing is call my office at 502-937-5287. We talk to folks all the time. I'm happy to talk to you. You will probably talk to one of my staff members when we first come in. They'll get some basic information. But I try to call everybody back, if possible, the same day. Sometimes I might be in a hearing or depositions or out of the office. It might be the next day. But I try to call folks back that call in the office as soon as I can. Some other places I don't think have as much contact with the attorneys, but you will probably end up talking to an attorney who is me if you call the office. And I'm one of these guys that probably likes to talk too much, so you may have to get me off the phone before it's all over.
And friends, if you have other questions or you want to send him an email, you can do that via his website. And Scott has a really good website. There's a ton of information out there, and you'll also see some previous cases and results and things like that Scott's I guess earned for it on behalf of his clients. But you can check that out at ScheynostLaw.com. That's spelled SCHEYNOSTLAW.com. And once again, that's a wrap for episode 5. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of Hurt at Work. Scott will be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. For more information, be sure to visit ScheynostLaw.com. That's SCHEYNOST Law.com. You can also follow Scott's Workers Comp office on Facebook. Until next time, be safe and remember, Scott's ready to help, especially when you and your family need it the most.